I'm delighted to have with me today Bob Moran, a multi-award-winning artist, illustrator, cartoonist, and freedom fighter. Bob, you briefly worked as a political cartoonist for The Guardian before spending a decade with The Telegraph, where you established yourself as one of the most revered and popular satirists in the UK. Earlier this year, you joined the Canadian-based Democracy Fund, creating groundbreaking, beautiful and scathing artwork against the tyranny inflicted by the governments around the world that ostensibly began with a manufactured crisis in public health due to the SARS-CoV-2 virus. These works have brought you international acclaim. How did you end up becoming a cartoonist for The Telegraph?
Well, I always wanted to be a cartoonist since I was really quite young. As soon as I could hold a pen, I was drawing funny pictures and poking fun at the people around me and what was going on. And then when I was about 12, I found out about newspaper cartoonists and decided that's what I wanted to do, and spoke to my teachers at school, and they said, yeah, we think that's probably what you ought to do, but we don't know how you do it. Went to university, did illustration, but I was lucky I was allowed to specialise in doing political work and satirical stuff. And after university, just sent work to editors and different people all the time, often not hearing anything back. I used to go down to London with my portfolio and try and attend exhibitions and things and get to know other people in the industry. And in 2010, in the summer, The Guardian let me fill in for some of their cartoonists when they were on holiday. And then the following year, a job came up at the Telegraph. And I was actually at the point of almost giving up. And I signed on to do teacher training. And I was going to go and do that, which I was quite excited about because I didn't feel I was getting there. I thought maybe I'm not going to make it. And then I got this call from the Telegraph saying, can you come in and do a kind of trial for having this job? And that was that. So by 25, I had a regular gig at this major newspaper, and it was a dream come true. You know, really exciting and daunting. I was still pretty young, and there was a lot I needed to learn. But I thought, wow, I could be here till I'm 85, you know, and I'd drop off my stool. But it didn't work out that way, and I was there for 10 years, and at the end of last year, I was fired because of my stance on all of this, everything that's been going on and the government restrictions and my Twitter activity, refusal to stay quiet about certain things. And that was daunting and frightening for a time, but actually now things have worked out very well, and I've really broadened my audience, and I'm able to reach people all over the world. And I'm working with a charity in Canada called the Democracy Fund, and they pay me to produce 3 cartoons a week, which I then offer free to any publisher or anyone with a blog or magazine. Anything can download the work and use it.
A significant proportion of your artwork, critical of government restrictions, were produced during your tenure at the Telegraph. You appeared to be one of the select few, most of whom were from the Telegraph, given license to criticise the government's approach. I'd go as far as to say that in the early months of the restrictions, the Telegraph appeared to be a beacon of hope, as they supported the likes of yourself and other journalists on their payroll. What was your relationship like with your employer, and how was it able to be so fruitful in those early months of government impositions?
It was good for a while. Certainly initially it appeared that we were all more or less on the same page in terms of the editors I was working with and lots of other journalists. You know, I think we all found ourselves entering into this without really knowing exactly what was going on, and there was a lot of shock and awe, I guess, from the authorities suddenly putting us in this situation nobody thought we could ever be put into. And it was taking a bit of time to adjust and work out how we felt about it. But I remember having conversations really early on with colleagues saying, look, aside from anything else, the ethics don't make any sense. it's not morally justified, whatever else you may think about the data or the models. And they agreed, and they said, yes, it's basic moral philosophy going down the drain. And I said, well, I want that to be my angle. I'd like to focus on that in my work. And they said, yeah, great, really happy for you to do that. And you had lots of journalists writing along those lines as well. And certainly for the first year, I was given quite a lot of freedom. I mean, I suppose it was fortunate in the sense that I'd been there for nearly 10 years. And so I'd built up a degree of trust with the editors, and they respected my ideas, I suppose. Maybe I wouldn't have had so much freedom if I'd only just started out. Looking back, it's surprising now, where we are now, but at the beginning it didn't seem surprising because my whole view was this is so obviously wrong that it shouldn't be controversial, shouldn't be brave, it shouldn't be dangerous to take this stance. I'm just stating quite obvious truths here. And there wasn't really much pushback until we got to just before the vaccines came out, not vaccines, the injections, and then things started to get tricky. But actually then I went off on leave for 6 months, so I wasn't actually working for the paper, which I was glad about because I thought, there'd be a lot of friction if I was working at the moment. And in my time off, I'd produced some work independently that was more along the lines of what I would want to say. And I suppose that gave me a little bit of a taster, if you like, into being independent. Editorial control is difficult. I mean, if you're a cartoonist, you have to accept that you're working for editors, you're working for a specific readership. Your work is never going to be 100% your own. And it never bothered me in the past because I always had this approach of, to an extent, I keep my own politics out of it. I was always quite central politically, I suppose, and I thought on any given day, whoever I think is making a fool of themselves or deserves criticism, that's who I will criticise. And obviously sometimes if you work for the Telegraph, you're going to get a bit of a steer, and they're going to say, they want you to be meaner to Jeremy Corbyn than to Theresa May or whoever it might be, and you think that's fine because that's what the readers want. But this situation was different because I thought it's not really political, it's far wider ranging than that. This encompasses everything. I feel really strongly about it, and it's directly affecting me and my family. So that friction suddenly appeared, and it was a relief to begin with that I wasn't being constrained, but it certainly did get to the point where I was being urged to do, for example, pro-vaccine cartoons, which I just didn't want to do, and I said, look, I don't mind just not doing any on that subject, but I'm not going to do anything that actually is encouraging the vaccine. And so yeah, it got difficult.
You mentioned that you went on leave. Once that happened, were you still having regular conversations with the editors? Did you get a sense of change in the paper's direction through discussions you were having with the editors? Were there any conversations about whether or not the imminent authorization and release of the COVID injections had anything to do with the change in attitude at the paper?
The way I was working before this started, certainly for the past 3-4 years, has been fairly detached from the paper. I mean, I've worked from home since 2018 and would only go into the office like once a year. When I started, I was in there all the time, but eventually it wasn't working, it wasn't convenient, so I worked from home, and it was a good setup, but I would basically make one phone call in the morning to someone on the comment desk, talk about the news that day, what was going on, here's what I'm thinking of doing, send them in a sketch. They would hopefully say, yeah, that's great. And then you produce the cartoon, give another quick call after you file to make sure they've got it okay. And that's it. I wasn't sitting in on meetings and talking to editors all the time. But obviously in those brief phone conversations, I'd pick up on what the vibe was, what people were feeling in the office. I became much more vocal on social media than I had been before. Always in the past, all I did was put out cartoons. There was nothing else about my own views. And I'd started to do that. And there had been a few subtle warnings from colleagues and editors. And I know certain colleagues had got very upset about the things I was tweeting and had gone to chief executives and people saying, oh, you should do something about this guy. But nothing had come of it. And I was kind of told not to worry about that. In fact, sometimes I would get emails from editors about a tweet saying, oh, I think you're right about this, actually. Yeah, that's a good point. So I felt like I didn't need to worry too much. And then the support, I suppose, started to ebb away. And I got this sense that there was a narrative shift that everyone had kind of agreed to adhere to, and I wasn't prepared to do it. And that, I think, really is why I lost my job. There's a scenario in which I should really never have been disciplined, let alone fired over what happened. So I think they saw an opportunity to maybe get rid of someone who wasn't playing the game,
What exactly happened that led to your sacking? On what grounds were the paper able to find a way to dismiss you?
When you work for a newspaper, and I was fully employed, so I wasn't on retainer or anything, I was actually a member of staff, and you agree to adhere to the editorial code, which has all sorts of rules about conduct, and particularly it addresses the way you can behave on social media. Now, interestingly, lots of these codes and rules seem to have gone out the window over the past 2 years in terms of journalistic practice and responsible writing and fact-checking and all of this stuff. But, I'm a cartoonist, first of all, right? I mean, I'm a sort of professional rebel. I'm supposed to be slightly against the grain, a little bit edgy, a bit dangerous. I didn't think it was a problem with me voicing my views, saying what I was angry about. The other thing is, of course, that my personal family circumstance meant that my daughter, who's disabled and has lots of additional needs, was suffering very badly as a result of everything that was being done, all the restrictions. So anyone calling for further restrictions was effectively, in my eyes, saying they wanted my daughter to suffer. Now, a big part of my stance throughout the last 2.5 years is not as a journalist or a satirist, it's a dad trying to defend his child, trying to stand up for her. I have to put that first before any kind of contract or editorial code. And there's lots of doctors tweeting all the time, as you know, calling for more restrictions and teenagers to be vaccinated and all this stuff. And you get very angry and you think, oh, I'm going to reply to this or I'm going to share it, and you don't because you think, oh, it's probably going to land me in trouble. So you put your phone down and go do something else. And one particular day, I think things were particularly hard at home. And I saw a tweet from a doctor called Rachel Clark, who had, long track record throughout the whole thing of supporting lockdowns and vilifying everyone who went on the marches and all these things, saying she'd received verbal abuse for wearing a mask on the tube. And I shared it and said she deserved verbal abuse for what she'd done. Maybe some of the people on that tube were like me, and their family had been really affected by the things people like her were calling for. And I thought, you don't get to come on here and whinge, when these people whose lives you've helped destroy maybe had a go at you for wearing a mask. Accept some consequences, for what you've done. And there was a big Twitter pile-on. All these blue tick accounts were calling for me to be fired immediately. I was suspended, and then I had to go in for a disciplinary hearing. And I was, told how I'd violated the editorial code, and specifically brought the paper's reputation into disrepute. That was the key thing. And they wanted me to acknowledge that and apologise for it, which I wouldn't do because, as I pointed out to them, they'd spent 2 years publishing various articles supporting the lockdowns, supporting vaccination of teenagers, enabling this horrific tyranny. And I said, nothing I could tweet could damage your reputation in the long term more than what you've already done. So, I wouldn't do that. And I said, I'm a father defending his child. And if you want to sack me for that, go ahead. And they did. And the paper was fully aware of my circumstances to the point where I produced several films, award-winning films for them, about how difficult it was to be the father of a disabled child, and they were happy to capitalise on that. But they weren't happy when I stood up and defended her online. So I think, that says quite a lot about their values.
Those in power really played the vulnerable card to perfection when it came to restrictions. In July 2021, the government decided that children and teenagers would only be injected against COVID-19 if they were vulnerable to the virus on the advice of the JCVI. Organisations meant to be fighting against the COVID regulations for the benefit of children, such as Us for Them, thanked the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson for rejecting calls to mass vaccinate children despite vulnerable kids being thrown under the bus. We witness history repeating itself with medical experimentation on the most vulnerable in the population. Nazi Germany reserved its worst cruelty for the most vulnerable. The decision by the Prime Minister was deeply disturbing. You yourself have a daughter that was deemed vulnerable under these announcements. With all the hysteria around how the vulnerable were at greatest risk from the alleged deadly virus, you, as a loving father, could easily have been one of those parents thanking Johnson and going along with ensuring your daughter was protected in every way possible, including the administration of COVID injections, but you chose not to. Why?
This whole concept of the vulnerable is such a key point. It's one of the linchpins under the whole thing, the whole deception. And it caught me at the beginning, because our daughter is vulnerable to lots of things. She's got cerebral palsy and severe epilepsy, and her epilepsy is basically gets worse anytime she's ill with anything, or a bit tired or hungry or low sugar. So right at the start, there was this brief period of a couple of weeks where nobody really knew what was going on. No one knew exactly what this thing was that had spread from China. And the limited information we had was, here are the groups of people who we think are particularly at risk. And on that list was anyone with cerebral palsy. So initially, this was before lockdown happened or anything, we took the children out of school and we stopped going out for about a couple of weeks. Because you thought, well, why take the risk? Nobody knows, what if that's right? Then during that time, I dug a bit deeper into why this had been said and why these groups had been categorised as vulnerable. And I discovered that the cerebral palsy, the reason for those people being in there wasn't because the people themselves were more at risk from this virus. It was because the people who cared for them, because lots of them had carers, were likely to be off sick. And I thought, hang on, what's going on here? That is so clearly, deliberately pulled out of context to frighten people. So that was one of the first instances where I thought, what's going on here? This doesn't feel right. And ever since then, we've had this idea of people being vulnerable has been used to manipulate the fear. And the thing is, again, it's all about context. Yes, loads of people in society are more vulnerable to all sorts of things than other people. They're always at more risk from everything. That's the whole point. But people were made to think that you were fine yesterday and today you're vulnerable because this new virus has arrived, and that's not what was happening. People weren't suddenly more at risk. It was the same. If this virus hadn't arrived and we went into our normal flu season, the vulnerable would be the same level of vulnerability and everyone else would be the same. There was no change in their situation, but everyone was led to think suddenly we have this group in society who are the vulnerable, who we must protect. And you think, but you weren't doing any of this to protect them 2 years ago, and their risk is still the same. I think it's so cruel that all these families, like us who have disabled children, for example, have gone along with this idea that they suddenly need to protect them from this new risk, when the risk is the same. Yes, they're vulnerable, but the vulnerability is the same as it was before. And it's very sad. We'd all like to live in a world where we all had exactly the same defences and didn't have to worry about these things. But the fact is there are lots of people who are at increased risk. It's the same as the elderly, If you're old and you've got heart disease and Alzheimer's and stage 4 cancer and you're already in hospital, you're really vulnerable if you catch any kind of bug. It's probably going to kill you. That was always the case. But suddenly they're all vulnerable as well. Yeah, but they're always vulnerable. It's ludicrous, this idea. And then, of course, it was used to get people vaccinated, or the vulnerable need. And actually, they're probably the last people who should have had this experimental injection, So, yeah, I have a real problem with that word vulnerable now.
There is much to admire about you, Bob. But what stands out is your willingness to allow your vulnerable eldest daughter as much freedom as possible, despite there being a greater risk to her from your decisions than most other children. You do not wish to protect her to the extent of infringing on her desires and freedoms. In the name of safety and protection, children have become stifled, prisoners if you like, unable to take any risk. Can you explain how you overcame the need to excessively protect your daughter from harm and find the right balance in her innate desire to be free whilst analysing the risks to her?
It was very tricky at the beginning. You suddenly become a parent and it's not anything like what you imagined it was going to be. And you go through this initial phase of horror, not knowing whether your baby's going to survive or not, and then learning that she will be disabled. You don't know how disabled she'll be. So your whole life is turned upside down, and you realise that things will probably never be the same and not how you imagined. You feel very guilty. You feel immediately like you failed to protect them, like you let them down, and you become totally obsessed with protecting them, not causing them any more harm, and just doing everything you can to nourish them and make them better and keep them safe. And as Poppy got older, eventually she learnt to walk very late, but then of course she was very unbalanced. She would fall over a lot, and her eyesight is affected by her brain injury, so she doesn't see things. She can trip down steps. It's a constant battle to keep her safe and stop her harming herself. But we realised after a bit that this was really eating us up, and it was like a very dark energy hanging over our whole family. And that the more obsessed we were with keeping her safe and worrying about whether she got ill and had a fit and things, everything you do in that direction takes something away from her joy, her spontaneity, her sense of self, and actually her ability to forget that she has all these problems, which is one of the things you want most of all for your child. Being a loving parent is, yes, about giving your child protection, but it's also about giving them freedom. You can't do one without the other, or you're not doing it right. And that's really, having concluded that, I suppose 8 or 9 years ago, it really informed my approach to all of this, because it's not protecting people and keeping them from harm. You can't just do that if you're also removing their joy, removing the meaning from their lives, removing their sense of spontaneity and agency. It's also this thing of trying to dictate what other people should do to protect your child. When we found out that any illness was going to trigger her seizures, which at one point were really, really serious, and we were having to go to hospital every other week in the ambulance, and there were some really, close calls. We could have said, no one attends school or nursery with her without doing a PCR test. No one with a cold is allowed to get, because she could literally die if she gets a cold. So we won't allow all the other children, if they're sick, they have to stay off. That's the world we now live in. That was the ideology that was pushed on us for 2 years. We never dreamt of doing that because we didn't have the right to do that. You don't have the right to dictate. We've been placed in this situation, and it's horrible, and it's really hard as a family, and you have to cope with it, and you have friends, and you have other family who can help you. But you don't say to the rest of the world, this is your burden too. Your children must suffer because my family has this. It's our burden to bear. It's the health services' burden to bear because it's their fault. They refuse to bear the burden more often than not. But it's not for us or anyone else to start looking around and saying, you've all got to disrupt your lives, your children must suffer because my child is suffering. We can't have a society that works like that.
In August 2022, one of the biggest critics of the measures taken against populations across the world in order to fight the alleged virus, Dr. Mike Yeeden, a former vice president of Pfizer, dropped a bombshell. He stated that he no longer believes respiratory viruses exist. Since the 34 months of the initial outbreak of COVID-19 being first announced, a growing number of health professionals and scientists have stated that they do not believe in the existence of exogenous disease-causing transmissible viruses. If that were the case, of which there is plenty of evidence, that would end the debate around whether or not interventions were needed or the degree to which they were required. It also could potentially end fear, division, and the need for any kind of treatment. The existence of viruses is fundamental to everything we've been through for nearly 3 years. Where do you stand on the existence of viruses?
The implications behind the idea that viruses may not exist or may not be what we've been told are massive, because it completely demolishes that whole idea that being near to other people is dangerous. The air we breathe might kill somebody else. It's something that I came across right from the start. As soon as I was beginning to speak out against the restrictions and argue my point about the ethics of it all, people were getting in touch and saying, well, viruses aren't real. They've never been proven to exist. And initially I found it quite irritating. I was sort of thought, go away. I'm not interested in that because, and this is still important, this is still an important point to make, the strength of our argument about why all this has been wrong does not rely in any way on viruses existing or not existing. The virus can be as real as you want it to be, can actually be as dangerous as you want it to be. You can have all of that. It's like lockdowns can work. You can have that. Lockdowns could be effective. We never needed to prove lockdowns didn't work. This is the point. You can say we're in an emergency and we need to do something. I don't mind that. Have that as well. We're not doing this. That's the point. We shouldn't have done what we did. Should never have been on the table. People say, well, what if that was the only thing we could have done? If that was the only thing we could have done, the right thing would have been to do nothing. That's the point. That's the fundamental argument, is that they didn't have an argument, the other side, at all. It is so totally monstrous what they were proposing and nonsensical. Now, the fact is it wasn't the only thing on the table by any stretch of the imagination. There were plenty of things that they could have done before getting to this, before implementing a communist authoritarian regime that actively killed people. Even if you were considering that, do some other things first, for God's sake, before you get to that. So it frustrates me a bit, because obviously evidence has come out now that the lockdowns didn't really have an effect, and some people on our side are holding it up as a victory, as vindication. You think we never needed that. We didn't need to prove that they weren't going to work because they were ethically wrong. That's the whole point. But anyway, coming back to the existence of viruses, obviously it seemed a bit unnecessary and it seemed unhelpful, these people, and I wasn't interested in it. But obviously, over 2.5 years, you're immersed in graphs and you're being shown data all the time, and you're speaking to people who've studied viruses and think they know about waves and variants and things. You begin to get a bit suspicious about this. You think, there's so much of this doesn't add up, and you realise, I suppose, first of all, that virology is a very young field of science, and B, extremely theoretical. And when you begin to look into it, you think, well, at the very least, there are some important questions here. There's lots that doesn't add up. Now, my thinking at the moment, where I've got to with investigating this idea, is that I think there are 3 possibilities with the existence or non-existence of viruses. The first possibility is that it's a total lie. There's no such thing as viruses, never proven to exist, and they were deliberately invented as an excuse for making people ill with toxins and poisons, the implications of which are obviously massive. The second possibility is a kind of in-between, sort of halfway house, where yes, viruses do exist, but possibly only in the form of your common colds. And maybe we do pass those to each other, but scientists and commercial interests have taken this idea and basically used it as an excuse for all kinds of other diseases that have nothing to do with these viruses. But they've just said, this is a virus, that's also caused by a virus. And those things aren't. There are other chemicals and things that are poisoning us. However, I suppose what I mean is both things could be true. There may be viruses, but a lot of the things we've been told are viruses might not be. And then the third possibility is that viruses are real and everything we've been told is a virus is actually a virus, and all the diseases linked to it are caused by that virus, and there's no scandal. It's all correct. Now, of those 3, the last one is the least likely to be true, in my view. I don't know which of the first 2 I think is more likely at the moment. I entertain both of them. With a lot of these things, when I look into them, I often come to the conclusion of maybe the truth is somewhere in between. But this thing with viruses is a good example of a wider problem, I think, where and this speaks to the divide between people. We often say, well, why are we on this side and so many other people are not on that side, and what is it that connects us? I think that most people have an instinctive response to information that tells them if there's something odd about it, if it doesn't make sense, if there are questions that need to be asked. I think most people can tell when they're being lied to about something. But there's a psychological mechanism in the brain, and that's what differs. I think there are people who are told something bad has happened or something bad exists. And if they get that voice challenging it, saying, I don't know if that's true, they will say, but the lie I've been told disturbs me so much. And they acknowledge that if that's not the truth, then the truth is something even worse. It's something even harder to deal with. And they simply don't want to entertain that. They don't think they can cope with it. So they force themselves to go along with the lie, to the point where often they'll furiously, aggressively defend the lie to protect themselves from having to go anywhere near the truth that's more frightening for them. And then there are other people who reach that point and say, they have the opposite response. They say, I don't care how bad the truth is, how all-encompassing and life-changing and world-changing the truth might be, I need to know what it is. And I'll go to the ends of the earth to find it. And I think that's definitely the case with this idea about viruses not existing. For a lot of people, if it's true that there are no viruses, the implications are so vast and what must be the truth is so dark and disturbing, they just don't want to touch it. And I'm afraid we're at a point in our history where we've got to go near this stuff. We can't afford to be protective about these things anymore. I think there's also a middle group there of people who will acknowledge that something isn't true, that they're being lied to, but they will still reach a point along the line where they can't go any further. You see it with people who still maintain that this is all incompetence and that they can't go beyond that because they're frightened of what they might find there. It's interesting. I think the people behind this are very aware of these psychological mechanisms. They knew that most people, even if they told them, they made it perfectly plain, look, we're not being honest with you here. We're mocking you. They would still cling to the lie because they're terrified of what the truth will be.
It does appear that those promoting the globalists' agenda are subliminally revealing the truth in their messaging when they try to encourage the population to go and harm themselves. For example, we've seen dozens of well-known figures recite a similar script stating how they tested positive for COVID again with mild symptoms, yet were thankful having received 4 doses of the injection, encouraging others to get jabbed if they hadn't already. Isn't that clearly the cult mocking those of us who know the truth?
There's so much mockery that goes on. There's so much deliberately overt hypocrisy that is laughing. They're perfectly aware of how many of us are out there who know what's going on and how sinister it is. And it does often seem they make these statements and they put out this propaganda. It's as much to mock us as it is to keep the sheep, if you like, the people going along with it in line. And they're saying to us, look how obvious this is. You will think when we say this, it will end the whole thing, but just you watch. All the people are going to get, for example, the Pfizer data was released. It was an example of something of like where you might think, right, this is it now, it's over. I mean, how many times have we heard people say, the narrative is collapsing, the narrative is collapsing. You think these people are howling with laughter because they give us this stuff. And then they say, you watch next week, they'll be queuing for their boosters. And they do. And it's torture. And we have to sit and watch this happening. This isn't an argument. It's not a debate. It never was. We're under attack. We have been from the beginning. And it's one of the most devious wars ever waged because about 95% of the victims don't know they're under attack. In fact, they are harming themselves. You don't need to fire a shot. You don't need to drop any bombs. You put up some posters that essentially say, go and harm yourselves. And your enemy does it. That's what we're dealing with here. And there is still good people, good journalists and people who seem to think that one day there'll be one piece of data or one study or one article will be written or one interview that will make these people turn around and go, oh my goodness, we're so sorry. We made an awful mistake and now we can see. You've made us aware now that what we did wrong and the whole thing will stop. It's not going to happen. That would have happened in the first few months if that was really going on. And so we're in this awful situation where, I realised this early on. this isn't a civilized debate, this isn't an argument that we can win here. But at the same time, what are we going to do? We can't call for any kind of violent action. We can't try and do anything like that, because aside from anything else, we're in such a minority. Even going on peaceful marches, we're attacked by almost everyone else as lunatics and dangerous. You have to just try and make people aware that they're under attack. You can't do anything else until you've got enough people who actually acknowledge what is being done to them. You're never going to succeed at stopping the people doing it. And so, to an extent, I often think what I'm doing is a waste of time. The petitions are a waste of time. The debates are a waste of time. Analysing this data is a waste of time. Because what we really need to be doing is just stopping the people doing this, but we can't. We're forced to engage in this phony war, if you like, because we have to get the numbers. And the thing is, once enough people understand what's happening, in all likelihood, we won't need to be violent. Probably no one needs to get hurt. If enough people stand up, they'll crumble. They're cowards. They're so weak. They don't want to fight, All we need is enough people to just say no, like, we see through what you're doing, and they'll run away. Look at what Trudeau did. When those truckers started to protest, he literally ran away and hid. That's who these people are. We shouldn't forget that.
Everyone's on their own journey to find truth and meaning in their lives. It's therefore very difficult for any individual to awaken others. All we can really do is be the change we wish to see. Your artwork has clearly evolved since the start of the insanity in the name of a health emergency. As a result, many have found you to be an inspiration in effecting change in their lives. Have you been surprised at the impact your work has had on people?
I have been shocked at the impact of my work, and I'm still surprised by people who get in contact from various parts of the world and say it's helped them. And I do know I've woken a lot of people up. They've seen a piece of my work and changed their mind about what's been going on. And that's really humbling. And people have started seeing family again, or maybe seen a loved one before they died that they wouldn't have done otherwise. And I can die happy knowing I've done just one or two of those things. It's amazing to hear about that. It's a spell, isn't it? People are under a spell, and there's something about imagery where if you can get it right, it can break this spell somehow. That's what I think happens. Yeah, it does have an almost mystical quality, as ability to break through the barriers that they put in front of people's brains. I'm sometimes surprised by it. I'll do a piece of work and I think, I don't know if this is going to work, or I don't know if this is going to have much impact, and it does. And I'm still the same person I always was. I still have the same values, and I'm just trying to portray the truth as I see it. I'm not a particularly interesting person. I'm not that complicated. I have a very straightforward life, I suppose. I'm not part of any clubs. My family history's not particularly remarkable. I'm just a guy who loved to draw. I just, sit up in my attic drawing pictures, and because that's all I've got. I sort of thought, well, how can I fight this? That's what's in my armoury, and so I should use it to the best of my ability as much as I can.
Only last week, there was a report out based on the ONS data showing that England recorded another 1,009 excess deaths in a single week compared to the 5-year average, bringing the total to 26,000 since April 2022, also suggesting COVID injections are to blame. With all that's going on, it seems as if there really is a purpose to the work that you're now doing, whereas in the past, it was almost as if you produced work to please the readership and satisfy your employers. Now your purpose appears to be to save humanity. There can be no greater mission than that. Perhaps you're here for this very task, Do you get a sense that this might be why you're here at this time on Earth?
It does feel like this is the thing I was supposed to do with my talents, gifts, whatever you want to call it, not be a newspaper cartoonist poking gentle fun at domestic politicians. I think other people have said this, there is this sense that we were all supposed to be here now for this. And I never knew where my interests and talents came from. It's not like other people in my family have done this before. Part of me feels like I'm supposed to be here with these skills now to do this. It's a shame many other people with these skills haven't chosen to fight on our side. I can't imagine not doing it.
What piece of artwork is your favourite? The one you're most proud of?
I've done so many. They all are done in a slightly different frame of mind. Some of them I'm very angry when I do them. Some of them I'm frightened. Some of them I'm feeling optimistic and full of love and joy. And so it's hard to have a favourite. I mean, the one that's very special is Stand Firm, the demon and the mum with her child, protecting her child. It's had the most impact, I think. It's the most kind of widely shared and spoken about, and it's the one people refer to when they get in touch with me. I know that's had an important impact. That has dissuaded people from giving their children the injections. I know that's happened. Didn't plan it, didn't think of it, a few days beforehand or anything, didn't really sketch it out. I just sat down and did it one day, probably more quickly than any other cartoon I've ever done. Not sure where it came from, It's one of those extraordinary things. And it's done in my style, but then it's slightly different to anything else I've done as well. So, yeah, that one's very important to me, even though it's incredibly dark. And then I suppose at the opposite end of the scale is Never Surrender Your Right to Be with the People You Love, with the old couple on the hill, which is, again, just trying to remind people of what should be a very simple, uncontroversial truth of just, hey, let's not forget this.
The shocking thing is, people have forgotten this important truth of not surrendering their right to be with the people they love. We shouldn't have to remind people of this.
There are people out there who hate that image and think it's incredibly irresponsible and dangerous.
I recently witnessed a middle-aged couple at Waterloo railway station kissing with masks on. That's the level of depravity we're dealing with. I found the entire spectacle to be very dangerous and a disturbing omen for the future of humanity.
I've seen people having their photos taken, and they're all wearing masks and the person's saying smile. At one time I said, why? They said, what do you mean? I said, why are you asking them to smile? He said, well, because we're taking a photo of you, but you can't see them. There are no smiles, and they don't realise. They've never thought about it.
Talking about masks and being unable to see smiles, I was asked to take a photo by a group of masked Chinese university students in Trafalgar Square. I told them to remove their masks for the photo so that I could see their smiles. They all instantly removed them as if there were no mask rules. Other days, I've had pupils at a school I work at complain about headaches. I ordered them to remove their masks, and they did, informing me of how much better they felt. In other words, they realised it was the masks giving them a headache. But the next day, the masks were back on most of the pupils. Do you find the religious-like ritual of mask wearing quite puzzling?
On the one hand, it can be very funny and absurd. You laugh at these people, and to an extent, you can gently mock them, and you should point out that what they're doing doesn't make any sense. But there's really serious darkness to it as well. I mean, I remember when our youngest was born, when she was a little baby, and you go around a shop, and old ladies will come and say hello if you've got a baby, but they'd have a mask over their face. Now, and first of all, we could see our daughter sort of recoil and look very disturbed, but they'd be saying, "Oh, don't you want to smile at me?" And I'd say, "But you're not smiling at her. And they say, well, yes, I am. I said, but she can't see your smile. And they don't even acknowledge it. They don't. And you think this is completely mad. You don't even understand that. And then you're sort of criticizing a baby for not smiling at you when you've got a piece of cloth over your face. You think we can't have this level of dissonance. We can't have this level of just a refusal to acknowledge what people are doing and why. The people wearing these masks could not give a satisfactory explanation for why they were doing it. And you just think, do you not understand how dangerous this is? Particularly people in school, teachers in school, working, with children, communicating with children with masks over their faces. And we had so much trouble with our school, having a child with loads of additional needs, and you have to fight for everything. It's a nightmare struggle with the council all the time to get the funding, and they always try and cut it. And she's got real problems with communication and her eyesight. She needs to see people's faces. In the end, it got so bad we had to get our solicitor to get the school to agree that no teachers would wear a mask while they were teaching her. But they kept going back on it. And then one day I turned up at school with her and they said, look, there's no one here who's prepared to not have a mask on. So she can't attend. Well, you either send her in or she can't come to school. So I thought, well, I want to find out why. So I went round to the classroom and there's this teaching assistant in there with her mask on. I said, oh, could I have a word with you, please? And of course, as she came to speak to me, she whipped it off, because they do, don't they? They take it off to speak to you, again, without realising what they're doing. And I said, oh, can I just ask why you're going to be wearing a mask today, working with my daughter? She looked terrified and she said, oh, I need to keep people safe. And I said, they're children. These are children. You don't need to keep them safe. And actually, my child is more vulnerable than any other child in this school. And I'm saying, I don't want you wearing a mask. Working with her. Then she said, I had a bad reaction to the jabs. And I said, I don't know what that has to do with wearing a mask, teaching children. And, at that point, the head teacher came in and told me I had to leave and I wasn't allowed to have this discussion. And we tried to arrange a meeting later on. She refused to have a meeting about it. It was extraordinary. And I said, all I want is an explanation. These people are doing things. They're looking after my child, and they can't explain their own behaviour. That really concerns me. I just want an explanation. And they couldn't give me an explanation. And they say it's the guidelines. And I said, my concern is that the guidelines that are in place now are actively harming these children and doing no good. But you're going ahead every day simply because they are the guidelines. If tomorrow Chris Whitty changed the guidelines to you have to pressure hose each child down with freezing water before they enter the classroom, I'm pretty convinced you would do it. That's the problem. These children are not safe in your care at the moment because you've completely lost your minds. And that was why we took them out, because I thought I'm not prepared to send my children to a place with these people who can't explain their own behaviour, can't justify their actions. I'm amazed really by other parents who don't seem concerned by that. You're not just sending them there to learn things. They are in the care of other adults, who are supposed to be protecting them and putting them first. This is the thing I said, why can't you just put the children first? You're putting all of your own neuroses and paranoia before the well-being of these children. You shouldn't be teachers, if that's your view. It's so sad. And again, the fact that it's being normalised and now everyone just wants to shrug and move on as if it didn't happen. You have to address this stuff. You have to, go back and look at what was done, because otherwise it's just going to keep happening.
The tragedy of this situation is that the very same senior leadership team and teaching staff who implemented child abuse upon the kids are still in those very roles, carrying on as if nothing happened, without remorse, contrition, or shame. They don't even acknowledge what happened. It implies that they're likely to inflict further tyranny upon our children at a whim, if instructed by those above to do so. It's as if they believe they have too much to lose, as they're so embedded into the fabric of the system.
There's no acknowledgement, there's no justice, there's no consequences. Everyone moves on to the next thing and forgets about it. And you can't do that. This was the most, whichever way you look at it, if you're on the other side, you should acknowledge this was the most extreme thing that's happened in our lifetimes. And it posed the biggest threat, certainly for half a century, to fundamental moral values of our society. A lot of them have been, if not damaged, destroyed, or worse, inverted. Now, if you declare the event is over, you can't just move on. You have to address that. You have to say, what's happened here? There was this assumption at the beginning that you could just switch these things off and then switch them on again. And I knew you can't do that. Once you start going down this road, it's very, very hard to go back. And you can see it now with everything else that's going on with children and all these drag queen story times, and even the attitudes to abortion, which has shifted so much, where you've got people, screaming that they love killing babies in the street, and you think the moral fabric is unraveling here of society, and we're all acting like it doesn't matter and we should just carry on. It's ridiculous, and the people responsible knew exactly what they were doing, and we're going to let them just get away with it. I couldn't understand at the beginning, where was the speech from a world leader about all of this, everything I've just described, leaving aside the data and the science and the health service being overwhelmed and all of that, just the defending it morally or not, the fact that there was no moral justification, and saying, look, this isn't just about who we're putting at risk in our society, it's about the values we're putting at risk, it's about who we are, how we perceive one another, whether or not we prioritise children, whether or not we prioritise democracy. I might think you should all stay in your houses, but you shouldn't want a leader who has the right to do that regardless. I could beg you, but I can't make it law, because then we become a dictatorship. So, where was that speech? It seemed like the easiest thing to deliver. These people have huge teams of people working for them. No one suggested it. Boris Johnson wrote a book about Winston Churchill. You would think he would want to get up and make exactly that speech.
Interestingly enough, back in 2015, in a speech made at an international conference titled The New World Order, A Recipe of War or Peace, the former Malaysian Prime Minister, Mahathir Mohamad, warned that the elites wanted to reduce the world population to 1 billion and will go to any length necessary to achieve their goal. Other than that, we have to look to works of fiction to find true inspiration relevant to the events of the present time, such as Charlie Chaplin's final speech in the 1940 film The Great Dictator, which gives its listeners a ray of hope in the face of overwhelming despair. Soldiers, don't give yourselves to brutes, men who despise you, enslave you, who regiment your lives, tell you what to do, what to think, and what to feel, who drill you, diet you, treat you like cattle, use you as cannon fodder. Don't give yourselves to these unnatural men with machine minds and machine hearts. You are not machines. You are not cattle. You are men. You have the love of humanity in your hearts. You don't hate. Only the unloved hate, the unloved and the unnatural. Soldiers, don't fight for slavery. Fight for liberty.
That's why I have a problem with this idea about politicians being pressured, by unions or the scientists or the media. If you understood the argument, you could have made a speech that any journalist would have looked a complete fool for arguing with. It wasn't daunting. This wasn't a dilemma. That's the whole point. It wasn't like, people say, I wouldn't have wanted to be in charge. I wouldn't have known what to do. I say, I would. It wasn't difficult. You've been led to believe that it was difficult. And it really wasn't at all. Another thing that's become quite controversial is when I think about that and I think, why did none of the politicians say this? Why didn't they stand up? And I think, well, maybe they were all morally compromised. Maybe they thought they didn't have the right to stand up and talk about these values because, lots of them are pretty unpleasant people. We know Johnson was a kind of bed-hopping cockwomble who had several illegitimate children. Perhaps he thought, I don't have the authority. But, I'll tell you who did, probably more than anyone else on earth, is the Queen. And arguably was more obligated than anyone else alive to stand up in that moment and say, this isn't right. We shouldn't be doing this. And I've actually sworn an oath to defend these things that are currently being dismantled all around us. And she didn't.
Instead, the Queen went the other way by misleading the public when she declared it was selfish not to get the toxic jabs and how it was every citizen's duty to do so.
I was always quite pro-monarchy, not in a mad way, but I thought it was a good thing precisely because we were supposed to have somebody outside of the political system who embodied our values, our priorities, what was decent, what kind of people did we want to be, what things could we do and what shouldn't we do. I thought that was an important thing. Now, the thing is, in her 70-year reign, it had never really been tested. Nothing had ever really come up where you think, this is your cue, this has got really bad. But it happened then. People say she can't intervene in politics. Politics wasn't functioning. There was no democracy. Every party in the House of Commons was agreeing with the insane tyranny. That's exactly the moment when the Queen should have stood up and said, at the very least, cautioned against it, and said, we need to be really careful here because here's the values we're putting on the line. Actually, this is going to harm children. This is actually going to kill some people. What the government's doing here is trading lives, not saving them. The churches are closed. Easter's been cancelled. Christmas has been cancelled. I'm supposed to be head of the church. I can't stand by and let that happen. Nothing. You think, has there ever been a greater abdication of duty? I mean, all the pomp and the ceremony and the tax money and the buildings and the waving and opening sports centres, if it was all ever going to be worth anything, it was stand up now and defend us and defend the values, and she just didn't. And then, as you say, she went even further. She told people to get injected, then she knighted Chris Whitty, then she dished out medals to the NHS workers in whose name all of this had been done. And again, she dies. And I don't think you should ever celebrate somebody's death, but people start celebrating her life and saying how wonderful she was, and you think she let everybody down. She betrayed us. She betrayed her people. She betrayed her oath. She betrayed her God. I'm sorry, but she did. And it's really difficult because a lot of people don't want to go there, and they want to, as part of their identity, even if they're on this side and they're against the lockdowns and they're against the injections and stuff, they would still celebrate the Queen's life. And I think we've got to be more careful than this now. We can't afford to just fall back into these things because we want to cling to some last remnants of the world we thought existed before.
We have to start to question everything, and quite possibly be prepared to unlearn a great deal of what was taught to us about the world we apparently live in.
She could have made such a difference, She was uncancelable. That's the thing. What were they going to do? Kick the Queen off Twitter? She really had the power. People would have listened to her. The media wouldn't have gone after her like they might have done with a politician.
Few would argue that the Queen wasn't generally well respected and loved. You'd be hard-pressed to find a Republican who didn't have respect for the Queen. Do you think the powers that be had something on her or her children?
People have argued with me about this and said, well, she couldn't have changed anything even if she wanted to. And I said, well, could I? Could Mike Yeeden, could James Delingpole, could Rainer Fulmer, did any of us think, I can stop this if I speak up? No, but we knew it was the right thing to do. That's the point. And do you mean to suggest that I somehow had more influence than Queen Elizabeth II? No. So it still would have been worth her saying something, wouldn't it?
The cult appear to be steering us away from the COVID-19 hysteria for now. Instead, the cult are racing forward with their plans to track all human activities through smartphones, smart cities, digital ID, facial recognition, use of central bank digital currencies, and climate lockdowns to potentially track, control, punish, surveil, and imprison us. The so-called elites want to dictate every aspect of our lives, from what we eat to where we go, right down to how many times a week we're allowed to shower. Many see these apparent advancements as necessary for our safety, comfort, and survival. But am I right in assuming that you view them as slavery?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the lockdowns, for all of the genuine damage they caused, were primarily, I feel, to psychologically condition people, to embed this idea of a threat and that you needed to be protected by the government and experts, and these people were not to be questioned. And again, what played into it was this idea of convenience. Lockdowns were sold as nothing. Just sit at home and watch Netflix and bake some bread and we'll save the world. And that's all you have to do. And that's how a lot of people still think of it. A lot of middle class people who didn't really suffer still refuse to acknowledge that it was hard for anybody. And so again, it's this, isn't it great? And you can get your shopping delivered, and there's Amazon, and you've got Netflix now, and Disney Plus, and Amazon, and it's great, isn't it? And you can have a go at homeschooling, and it's really not a problem for anybody. And again, it's psychologically conditioning people to convenience equals good, convenience equals progress, and that we need saving. We need authority and experts to save us. And so now what's very likely to happen is we're headed for economic catastrophe, which has been inevitable probably since 2008, certainly since the beginning of all this. It's what loads of people said from the very start. You can't do this without totally destroying the world economy, and it appears to have been their goal. But again, there will be an emergency declared, people will be totally unprepared, and they'll go to their government for help. They'll be crying out for help, and the solution will be centralised digital currency, which is really bad news for everybody. It will take away all agency from people, it will take away all privacy, and there's limitless conditions that can be put on it. That's one of the really scary things. If you tweet the wrong thing, or you don't get the right injection, or you haven't eaten the right thing that week, or you drive the wrong car, you might suddenly find that you can't access your money, or your money's been taken away, or you're just not allowed to buy certain things and shop in certain places. Now, people might say, oh, that's just, an exaggeration. There's no way it would ever go that far. People were saying the same thing about lockdowns 2 weeks before they happened. Everyone was saying they will never, ever lock everyone in their homes. And they did it for 2 years. So don't tell me anything is beyond the realms of possibility now. We know who these people are. We know what their principles are. Nothing. They don't have morals. They don't have principles. There's nothing they won't do. So this move towards an entirely digitally controlled world is really bad news for everybody. And again, it's getting people to see themselves as the problem. We're the disease. We're an inconvenience here. We're damaging the earth. We can't trust ourselves. We can't be responsible with our own lives, with our own agency. We can't read different opinions and come to our own conclusions. That's all really dangerous. We shouldn't want to do that. We should just want to surrender everything to these authoritarian figures and say, take my life, take my freedom and keep me safe. People want it. This is the whole thing about the kind of genius of this plan, is people are asking for all of it. It's not, people aren't being herded over a cliff. They're running and jumping, throwing themselves off. That's the thing. They're asking for the control. We have to keep doing what we can to convince them, I mean, all we're essentially saying, and all we've ever been saying, is you don't want to live in this world. You don't want to go where they're taking you. You think that you do, but it's the biggest mistake you've ever made. And when you get there, when you arrive, I guarantee you won't like it. And you'll look back and you'll go, why didn't we see this earlier? My goal is to try and get people to see that before it's too late. Because the train is accelerating, it's not slowing down.
I watched your interview for Scum Media in December 2021, in which you stated that the UK government was prepared to murder 200,000 people in order to try to slow the spread of a respiratory virus. Could you elaborate on that powerful statement, as I think this is of great significance in the grand scheme of events?
During the first lockdown, the government commissioned its own report into the effects of lockdown, this sort of risk-benefit analysis, or essentially it was asking how many people could die as a direct result of lockdown policy. Just from the first lockdown this was. And it concluded that around 200,000 people might die. But that was shortly afterwards, Bristol University looked at that study and said that's not accurate, it's actually closer to 500,000 people. Now, this was on front pages of all the newspapers, including the Telegraph. And obviously it's quite early, it was after the first lockdown, and it was one of those moments where maybe you thought, surely this has to be the end of it now. There's no way they can go on doing this. And again, you think we're about to come into the summer, so, slightly frustratingly, they've got an opportunity to just back off now and draw it all to a close and say, well, it's summer now, viruses don't spread in the summer, and maybe we overreacted slightly, but it doesn't matter. And, what do? They introduce a mask mandate and then go on having more lockdowns and tier systems and things. Everyone forgot about those studies. When you bring it up now, very few people remember it. Should have had a massive impact all over the world. Because, as I've said before, what it represents is deliberately trading lives. A government, and this is not the same as the trolley problem, this kind of, if you pull the lever, the train will go down this track and kill this many people, and if you don't pull the lever, then... This is taking direct action that will kill people, and it will kill people. Because you don't even know, you think that maybe it will prevent largely very elderly people from dying. And it's not an individual making this decision. This is a government. This is government in charge of 70 million people setting a precedent for essentially saying, if we think there's an emergency, if we think there's some kind of threat, we can just start killing people to save lives. And, after that, no one should have used the phrase saving lives after that report came out. It's trading lives. They were trading the lives of their citizens. That is ethically disgusting. Doesn't matter what you're faced with. It doesn't matter what the circumstances are. You can't do that. No one should want to live under a regime, and when they start doing that, they become a regime, not a government. They shouldn't want to live under a regime that can do those things. And again, we're now in a world where people have accepted that. What goes along with it, I think, which I didn't really touch on before, is that this was carried out alongside an awful lot of ritualistic practice. Right, so you've got a practice that's essentially human sacrifice, deliberately killing people to placate some unseen enemy, the evil virus god, whilst getting people to chant the same phrases, wear the same weird headgear, stand outside their houses applauding the people doing it. And you just think this is really not very far away from an ancient Mayan sacrifice ceremony. You know, the only difference is they aren't throwing severed heads down the steps at the baying crowds, but the crowds are still out there cheering. It's really dark and sinister. The wording as well, you know, very specific words they got people to use, and the same thing everywhere, all over the world. And you almost begin to think, have people been coerced into some kind of dark ceremony here without realising it under the veil of public health policy? I don't know. But either way, it's disgusting. And people need to wake up to the fact that it's disgusting, and it was done in the full knowledge of what it represented. You could argue that before they did the lockdown, somehow they were all so unbelievably stupid that they didn't think anyone would die. But once that report's come out, and once you've all done 3-4 months of lockdown everywhere, they all knew what it meant. They all knew what it was doing, and they carried on. And they still refused to accept that there should be any consequences for it.
In my view, all of the COVID rituals, including the jabs, are a metaphor for our allegiance to or rejection of the false consensual reality we have been imprinted with and trained to uphold all our lives. What have you witnessed as an antidote to the tyranny being inflicted upon humanity by the cult that has pleased you most and left you with optimism in terms of where we are now?
There are a few ways in which actually their agenda has backfired and resulted in the opposite of probably what they intended. And one really important way, I think, is so many divisions that we were told were there previously have just disappeared, whether cultural, political, generational. You suddenly find yourselves drawn to people who share your views on this, and maybe they're from a different country, or they have a different political background or a different religion, but you absolutely agree on these fundamental things, and you realise actually that other stuff's not important. And we were told for years that it really mattered and that we should not like each other or we wouldn't have anything in common. And you find yourself in a room full of all these different people who you would never have gone anywhere near before. Not necessarily you wouldn't have liked them, but you just wouldn't have been interested in meeting them. But you would assume that you wouldn't get on. And the energy is incredible. And the sense of unity and shared values is so powerful. And I think this is the thing that we can't lose sight of, is they've tried everything. They've really thrown everything at us. And I do think this was planned for a long time. They've had some of the most brilliant minds in terms of behavioural science trying to persuade people to do these things. It's been going on for 2.5 years, and it's lockdowns, it's masks, it's social distancing, it's getting the injection, it's testing yourselves. And if you've come through all of that and not done any of it, it's not just that you're brave and you're an independent thinker, you're incredibly powerful. You're a really, really powerful person, and that terrifies them, because they aren't actually very powerful people. They're pathetic people, they're really weak. If we can harness that, if we can really focus on that and understand that we're the ones with the power and it scares them, then we can probably come out of this the other side and get rid of these people, take away their authority, and start making something infinitely better, infinitely better.